Sup, y'all, and welcome to Industrialization and Global Integration, Unit 5, Part 9. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the age of imperialism.
And now for something completely different.
Now, the age of imperialism began arguably around 1700, but really picked up pace in the 1800s with the increased demand for natural resources and land due to the Industrial Revolution. The core countries, but especially Europe, had a plethora of reasons why they engaged in imperialism, which is the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or nation over a foreign country or region. This often resulted in acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies. And we can categorize the motivations of imperialism through the acronym EMPIRE. Now on this note, one of the motivations of imperialism was exploratory. The goal was to map out new territory, to locate indigenous or native people, and to identify natural resources available. For example, minerals, precious stones, animals, plants, etc. Also, due to the massive population explosion brought on by the Industrial Revolution, the imperialist countries sought outlets for population or crowding. One of the best known stories was about Dr. David Livingstone, who was a Scottish missionary and explorer in Africa who completely lost contact with the outside world in the late 1860s. Henry Stanley, a journalist, was sent to find him by the New York Herald newspaper, and when he found and greeted him in 1871, he stated the now famous words,
"Dr. Livingstone, I presume?"
The words are famous because of their tongue-in-cheek humorous nature. After all, Dr. Livingstone was the only white person for hundreds of miles. Now, another motivation was the military. The goal was to glorify their armed strength and to conquer and subvert indigenous people. In this way, the imperialists expanded and defended their respective nations. The imperialists had a huge advantage in weaponry and technology, and they used it to the fullest extent. Yet another motivation was political, in which the imperialist nations claimed land for the mother country and controlled other countries' governments. They were motivated in part to make sure their country had more possessions than other countries, who were competing for the same lands, resources, and advantages over their competitors. The next motivation was ideological. For many imperialists, a major goal was to make others more like themselves, like Westerners. Or they sought to make the natives adopt a Western perspective. The imperialists often adopted the ideas of social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest, in that Western culture was superior to everyone else's. Many of them also truly sought to improve the non-Westerners' ways of life. You can see the very famous poem White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, who was also the author of Jungle Book.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
The term white man's burden has been interpreted by some as racist, or possibly taken as a metaphor for a condescending view of the undeveloped national culture and economic traditions of the natives, as compared to the Western states. An alternative interpretation is the philanthropic view, that the rich, or the whites, have a moral duty and obligation to help the poor, or the natives, to better themselves, whether they wanted the help or not. Then we come to the very powerful religious motives. It was a major goal by many to convert native people to the Christian religion, to save souls by convincing natives that the religion was wrong, and to change the beliefs of the next generation. While many historians criticize this action as ethnocentric and egotistical, these missionaries and religious individuals helped to establish schools, medical facilities, and helped improve the lives of millions of people. And I've saved arguably the most important for last. Perhaps the greatest motivation of all was, no, not geography.
Yes, well!
It was economic. Imperialist states competed against other imperialist states in order to make more profit and gain more strength. The main goals dealt with supply and demand. Imperialist nations sought out colonies to obtain raw materials in order to produce goods. This was the supply side of the equation. The Industrial Revolution increased the need for raw materials such as coal, rubber, petroleum, natural gas, and so on. And the imperialist nations also sought out colonies to get native people to purchase their goods and services. This was the demand side of the equation. Relatively cheap raw materials were shipped and transported to the imperialist states' factories, processed into manufactured goods, and then sold back to their own populations as well as the natives in the respective colonies. This usually meant great profit for the imperialist nations. And this made the colonists dependent on the mother countries, as the name would imply, establishing a system of dependency that largely exists to this very day.
And now for something completely different.
We're going to look at how the world went from this to this. Let's look at some key advancements during the Industrial Revolution that made this possible. First off, we'll take a look at Edward Jenner, who was often called the father of immunology. Jenner noted that milkmaids were generally immune to smallpox. He postulated that the particles from cowpox pustules protected them from smallpox. Jenner tested his hypothesis in 1796 by inoculating an 8-year-old boy who was the son of his gardener. He scraped pus from cowpox blisters on the hands of a milkmaid and then inoculated the boy by scraping the pus under his skin.
That sounds good. I'll have that.
Now the boy did break out into a fever, but showed no full-blown infection, and then he had an immunity to smallpox. Jenner's vaccine was just the beginning of a medical revolution. Often called the father of microbiology, Louis Pasteur was a pioneer in germ theory, and through many experiments, he linked microorganisms to disease. In 1862, he famously developed the process of boiling liquids such as milk or wine to prevent them from spoiling as quickly. This is known as pasteurization. Later on, in the early 1880s, Pasteur developed a vaccine for anthrax, and in 1885, he developed a vaccine for rabies. His discoveries have saved the lives of countless millions. And then there's Joseph Lister, who was a British surgeon and pioneer of antiseptics, which are chemicals that either inhibit or kill microbes. Now, boiling liquids to kill microbes is fine, but you obviously can't boil humans to keep them from getting infected. So, by applying Pasteur's advances in microbiology, he promoted sterile surgery by using antiseptics to sterilize surgical instruments and to clean wounds. This led to a massive reduction in post-operative infections and made surgery much safer. And we can also thank him for that minty fresh breath. And so, because of better hygiene, that led to a drop in disease and the mortality rates. And just take a look at these charts. It took all of human history up until around 1800 to get to 1 billion people on the planet at the same time. Now it's quite remarkable that it only took about 130 years for us to get to the 2nd billion, and then only 30 years from that to get to another billion, and only 15 to get to a 4th. However, the trend today is that the world growth rates are slowing down somewhat, which is why you see the years in between the next billion going up slightly.
And now for something completely different.
Charles Darwin. Now, he adopted the ideas from Malthus about limited resources and applied these concepts to the development and evolution of plants and animals. While serving as a geologist and naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle in 1853, he observed varying species of animals on the Galapagos Islands and made several sketches of the wildlife he had seen there. He was astounded by the biodiversity in such a rich environment such as the Galapagos. And then, in 1859, he wrote On the Origin of Species, which highlighted his theory of natural selection, in which organisms become more or less common in a population depending on how adapted they are to their environment. Now, natural selection is different from artificial selection, which really is selective breeding. And here's Charles Darwin looking a little bit like Santa Claus. Now, people like Herbert Spencer read Darwin's work in the 1860s, and Spencer came up with social Darwinism, in which he used the term survival of the fittest, drawing parallels between his economic theories, which were applied to society and business, and Darwin's, which were applied to biology and evolution. Social Darwinism states that if a business or a society is the best fit for the environment, then it will succeed, as opposed to others. And we can move on even to Gregor Mendel, who is called the father of modern genetics. Mendel studied the inheritance of certain traits in pea plants in the 1850s and 1860s. He noted that there were dominant and recessive genes, and that the inheritance of these traits follows particular laws, which can be studied and predicted. And in the mid-1860s came along Francis Galton, who was also a half-cousin of Charles Darwin. Now, through statistical analyses of heredity, he showed that human traits could indeed be inherited. Simple things like eye color and hair color, but also more important things such as intelligence or natural resistance to diseases. And so he made certain recommendations, and as a result is known as the founder of eugenics. Now, some people feared that technology had gone to such a great degree that people who had inferior genes were passing on their weakness to the next generation. The fear grew that aiding the weak, or the poor, to survive and reproduce could drastically reduce the benefits of natural selection. So, people like Galton suggested the principles of animal breeding could be applied to humans.
Hey! Who rules?